Hello, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and what we are going to do today is we are going to talk about volitional acts in Chazal's understanding, meaning what do the rabbis think about certain things that they call reshut, volitional. You have permission to do them. What is this category? The reason why I want to know about this category is, first of all, because it's a really interesting category. I mean, my spouse is actually doing a doctorate on and writing on this right now. So it's all over my house and it's all over my head. But reshut is an interesting category because in a legal system, you would think something is either required or not required. What does it mean to say that something is voluntarily allowed? You can do it if you want. You don't have to do it if you don't want. What exactly is that category? And that category, of course, is very relevant because in the Gemara in Menachot this week, we see a Mishnah that tells us that women do not do semicha on animals. Women do not lean or lay their hands on the head of their animal when they're giving it as a korban. And the Mishnah makes it seem like this is the end of the story. And of course, the Gemara explains to us why that is. And that is because in Vayikra Perek Gimel, 3 times we see v'samach et yado, meaning a male hand. And each of those 3 times, we see that that means not this, a male, but not this other person. A male head of household, but not this other person, right? And one of those comes to exclude his wife. Same things happens in the Gemara in Kiddushin on Daf Lamed Vav. We have a Mishnah that tells us that women do not do smicha on animals. And there it's learned from a different place. It's learned from Daber el Bnei Israel, talk to the sons of Israel. This is the beginning of Sifra Vayikra, ... v'samach, and he shall place his hands, meaning Bnei Israel somchin, ve'ein b'no Israel somchot. The sons of Israel do smicha on their animals, but the daughters of Israel do not. But the truth is that even within tannaitic literature, that is not the end of the story. And the reason it's important that that's not the end of the story is actually because there is a statement in the Sifra, in Vayikra, meaning the halachic Midrash on Vayikra, that suggests nashim somchot reshut. Women have permission to do smicha if they want, meaning they have permission to lay their hands on the head of their korban of the animal if they want. And that actually becomes a major basis all over the Talmud Bavli for talking about women performing mitzvot that the rabbis say that they are exempt from. So the concept of reshut is actually very important, and smicha is actually the place where we start talking about that concept of reshut. So in this shiur, I want to do 2 things. Number 1, I want to talk about the concept of reshut a little bit. And of course, one day, God willing, my husband's dissertation will be out. You'll be able to read it. Maybe the book will be out. You'll be able to read it and see what he has to say about it. But in the meantime, I want to share what I've gleaned from seeing some of the things that he's been looking at. And secondly, I want to see what the Gemaras, not in Menachot and not in Kiddushin, but elsewhere, namely in Chagiga and in Eruvin, do with the idea of nashim somchot reshut, that women are permitted to volitionally do smicha on their animals, and how that becomes really the keystone for a conversation about women doing mitzvot that the rabbis declared them to be exempt from. So let's actually get started with the Sifra, the Midrash Halakha on Vayikra. I'm just looking for my share because no matter how many times I do this, I always will have a problem with my share for whatever reason. It's not exactly natural, but here's where it comes from, right? So first I gave you on the sources, if you want to take a look, that Mishnah in Kiddushin. I gave you the source in Menachot. Fine, great. The Sifra Nidava, Parsha Bet Obed, tells us, Bnei Yisrael, meaning the beginning of Vayikra is Daber el Bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel. We're here understood as the sons of Israel. Bnei Israel somchin, ve'ein b'no Israel somchot. The males of Israel do smicha on their animals, on their korbanot, and the females of Israel do not. But then comes Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon omrim, Nashim somchot reshut. Women may do smicha on their animal, reshut, volitionally. Amar Rabbi Yose, and Rabbi Yose continues, Amar li Abba Elazar, my father, Rabbi Elazar, told me, Hayalanu egel zivchei shlamim. We had a whole offering, a peace offering, v'hotzanuhu le'ezrat nashim, and we brought it out to the women, right? This is giving you an eyewitness account from the Mikdash. We brought it to the place where the women were, v'samchu alav hanashim, and the women leaned on it. And then he adds, lo mipnei shehasmicha bin nashim, not because leaning on the animal or laying hands on the animal is required of women, ela mipnei nachat ruach shel nashim, but rather to put their minds at ease, right? So you have these two different languages, nashim somchot reshut, and then you have mipnei nachat ruach shel nashim. So I want to talk about nashim somchot reshut a little bit, because the concept of reshut, again, strange concept. Either something is allowed or it's not allowed. Either something is required or it's not required and there's no reason to do it, right? But the truth is, this notion of reshut comes up very, very often. In fact, Pesach, which just passed at the time of the recording of this shiur, Shiv'at Yamim, the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael tells us, Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, again, rabbinic halachic midrash on Sifra Shmo, Shiv'at Yamim matzot tochelu, ach b'yom harishon tashbitus or mibadechem. Right, for 7 days you're going to eat matzah, but on the first day you're going to get rid of the chametz from your house. Now, Chazal learn on the first day you get rid of chametz, actually getting rid of your chametz on Erev Pesach, but that's for a different conversation. But the point is, la'asot harishon chova ushar hayamim reshut. So here it's being understood as ach b'yom rishon tashbitus or mibatechem means on the first day of Pesach is really when you're not having any chametz, meaning you're having matzah. That must be a chova, an obligation. But the other days of Pesach, it's just a reshut to eat matzah. It's just, you don't have to. You can, but it's just a reshut to eat matzah. Then the Gemara continues, the Mechilta, continues. It says, Atal mir lasot rishon chova shar yamim reshut. Are you sure it's the first day is supposed to be the one that is a chova, a requirement? Notice the opposition between a chova and reshut, a requirement, ushar yamim reshut, and the rest of the days are permitted but not required. Oh, and let's just be clear, we're talking about eating matzah. We're not talking about not having chametz, meaning that's clear that that's required throughout. Oh, ela lasot harishon reshut ushar hayamim chova. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe ach b'yom rishon is set out to be, that's the one where it's, not obligatory to eat matzah, but the other days it is. Talmud lomar, that's why the Torah says elsewhere, barishon be'arba'a asar yom lachodesh ba'erev tuchlu matzot. We actually have another pasuk that tells us you got to eat matzah, right? It's only a few psukim later. You have to eat matzah in the evening, right? Meaning on the night of Ted Vav, really. Hakatuv kva'o chova. Scripture makes that a requirement, right? Meaning, ha'in alecha lomar kelashon ha'acharon, ela kelashon harishon. So follow the first suggestion that we made, which is lasot harishon chova ushar kol yamim reshut, right? The first day of Pesach, it is obligatory to eat matzah, and the rest of the Pesach, you don't have to, right? This is very similar to what we say about a sukkah, same thing, requirement to eat in the sukkah at the beginning, on the first day, but the rest of the time, reshut. So this reshut is actually, sometimes we don't say it's a reshut for these people to do that thing. Sometimes we say the thing itself is a reshut. I want to also look at a few other examples of reshut that I think give us something to think about, right? We have in the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai on Im Kesef Talveh et Ami, right? Which is a pasuk that seems to indicate if you give money to someone in my nation, right? And Yachol reshut, so the Midrash says, maybe it sounds like if you lend money, like you can lend money if you want, you don't have to lend money if you don't want. Talmud lomar, nope, we have another pasuk in Devarim, va'avit ta'avitenu, you have to, right? You have to lend. Chova, lo reshut. It's a requirement, it's not a reshut. But Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amru, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, they said, Kol im ve'im shebatorah, anytime you say it says if in the Torah, which is what we would call like a casuistic example, right? If such and such is happening, then the following laws obtain, right? Does that mean that such and such has to happen? So says Rabbi Yishmael, every time it says im in the Torah to introduce a casuistic example, that's a reshut. Usually it's something you don't have to do, but you can do. Chutz mishlosha shehein chova, except for 3 examples in the Torah, zo achat mehem. This is one of them. Here im is a chova and not a reshut. Now I want us to notice it is being stated in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that im is usually reshut. Now, we're going to see in a minute, you might remember, maybe it was last year, that we make a distinction between the schools of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. When you look in Midrash Halakha, there are certain midrashim that are attributed to the school of Rabbi Akiva and certain that are attributed to the school of Rabbi Yishmael. What's this based on? Different klalim, different hermeneutical rules that they use, different philosophies. In fact, Mechiltas Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is generally attributed to the school of Rabbi Akiva. So I want you to notice it begins with the im refers to chova and not reshut. And then in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, they said every im is reshut except for these. So is the first opinion here saying every im is usually chova or not? Maybe the school of Rabbi Akiva, their default is chova, chova, chova. And the school of Rabbi Yishmael, their default is more reshut. So if that's the case, then Rabbi Yishmael sees a lot of reshut. His school sees a lot of reshut here. Let's just think for a second, what exactly does reshut mean? It sounds like chova is you're required. Reshut is you're not required, but it's positive. Is it a good thing? Are you supposed to do it, but we can't force you to do it? What exactly is it? I want to give one more example. And the other example is where reshut is not being distinguished from chova, an obligation versus not, but reshut is being distinguished from mitzvah, right? Mitzvah being something that the Torah told you to do, and reshut being something that is completely in the world of the mundane, okay? And this is based on a pasuk that is about a leprous house. V'tzivah HaKohen, before the Kohen comes to see the leprous house to pronounce it tameh, which will make everything inside tameh, the Kohen should command, upinu et habayit, they should, ufinu et habayit, they should clear out the house. B'terem yavo HaKohen le'rot et hanega, before the Kohen comes to see the possible leprous spots on the house. Why? Because we don't want everything in the house to become tameh, meaning if things are still in the house, if the bayit is tameh, those things are going to become tameh with it. And afterwards, the Kohen will come see the house. Now, what that means is you're actually delaying a little bit, right? Meaning you're delaying seeing the house because we want to give time to a person to get whatever is in the house out of the house. Now, the Sifra, Midrash Halakha on Vayikra, which is generally attributed to the school of Rabbi Akiva, says, for a groom who is in the middle of the marriage ceremony, if a groom gets what seems to be tzarat on himself, we also give him time. And the Sifra learns it from a different pasuk. But Rabbi Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, yeah, of course. We don't even need another pasuk to learn it from. Harehu Omer, don't we have a pasuk about a leprous house? V'tzivah kohen v'chulei. The Kohen is going to command them to get everything out of the house. Im mamtinim lo ledevar harishut. If you wait to look at the leprous spot for something that is completely in the realm of the mundane, people getting things out of their house, right? It's not for the mitzvah of marriage, not for the mitzvah of Sheva Brachot. It's not, right? Lo yamtinu lo ledevar mitzvah. Wouldn't we for certain wait if somebody is performing a mitzvah, namely a groom who is getting married? B'kamahi mitzvato, and how long is that mitzvah? Nireh b'chatan. Well, look at the chatan. Notnim lo zayin yemei hamishte. You give them the 7 days of the festivities, right? And b'chein beregel, And also, when you look at somebody on a festival, we would give them all 7 days of the festival. Meaning here, reshut is not contrasted with chova, right? Chova is obligation. Reshut is you're not obligated to do it, but maybe it has some value. Here, it's mitzvah is the opposition. Mitzvah is the Torah tells you to do something, meaning you have a mitzvah to do the 7 days of the regel. You have a mitzvah to do the 7 yemei mishteh, right? How that's extrapolated is a different conversation, but you have a mitzvah to do those things. Whereas the realm of reshut, where it's just, okay, we don't want the stuff in your house to become tamei, and we're willing to wait for that. That's just reshut. So here you have both reshut as not obligatory, but maybe has some value, and you have reshut as mundane, and that's where they're contrasted with different things. So Dr. Tzvi Novak actually wrote a few pages about this in his book, What is Good and What God Demands, and I want to just look at it for a moment. One thing he says is that he does think that there's a difference between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. They're schools. We emerge from the discussion with the following conclusions. The school of Rabbi Akiva tends to find chova, where scripture does not appear to call for it. Whereas the school of Rabbi Yishmael finds reshut not only where it represents the plain sense of scripture, but even in some cases where it does not. And he shows some of those examples where there's no im and they still see reshut. In the latter cases, the act labeled reshut may be weakly obligatory, even though the labeling does not itself semantically or pragmatically convey such weak obligation. He thinks you can see examples where Rabbi Yishmael's school is actually saying im, even when there's no im, that it can mean reshut. And in those cases, he wants to say, oh, well, maybe reshut is kind of a weak kind of obligation. But the point is, he's trying to say there's probably some value to the reshut. And then he looks at our third example that we just looked at in terms of reshut as the mundane world. It says, while reshut in opposition to chova or gezerah in the collections of Rabbi Yishmael, it's usually reshut versus chova, and the collection for Rabbi Akiva, it's usually reshut versus gezerah. While that opposition signifies the absence of obligation, right, that reshut, you're not obligated, but does not preclude the possibility of quasi-obligation or preference, right? It might be a good thing to do. On the other hand, the opposition of reshut and mitzvah demarcates the realm constituted by divine law, right? Mitzvah is you're supposed to do the 7 days of the regel. You're supposed to do the Shiva Yemei HaMishteh, right? From the realm that exists independently of the law, right? The latter realm, meaning the world that exists independently of the law, namely saving your stuff from becoming tamei, it doesn't escape the law's notice, right? In this very case, Vayikra 14:36 tells us it is understood as legislating concerning matters of reshut, but unlike the realm of mitzvah, it doesn't owe its existence or structure to the prescription of the Torah. So what you basically have here is you have that Chazal are recognizing that there is this whole realm of reshut. This realm of reshut may be a realm within halakha of non-obligatory action, but maybe it's considered positive that you do it, but it's not obligatory, right? It may be a whole realm that exists independently of halakha, meaning you have reshut in life. I go to the library. That's reshut. I put money into my bank account. That's reshut, right? Not everything is in the realm of mitzvah. So this is it's actually very unique. It speaks to something unique in terms of the layered thinking of Chazal, that they're able to have this category. It's not a category that we find really existing beforehand. But I also want to share an idea that seems to be really significant to consider, and that is, well, twofold. Number one, here, Nashim Somchot Reshut is Nashim Somchot Reshut sounds like it's saying it's not obligatory, but you can do it. But it also might be saying it's not off limits, meaning you're allowed to do it. It might be giving you permission to do it, right? As opposed to, oh, you don't have to do this, but you can if you want. It's basically saying it's not off limits from you. You are permitted to do it. So it's an interesting thing to consider that actually the word reshut, and this is the second point, the word reshut has a lot of different uses in Chazal, right? We think about reshut harabim, right? You think about rashut, the government, right? Al titbadal la rashut, don't become, known to the government. You think about reshut in the sense of permission, right? There's something about reshut that actually speaks very much to being authorized or to having authority, right? This is you have authority over this piece of land, right? The government has authority. When you're given permission, you're authorized by something. So it's possible that we might look at reshut instead of just looking at reshut as, is this thing allowed? Is it not allowed? We might actually look at reshut as a whole, like a whole segment of life over which you have authority, right? Meaning when it comes to mitzvah, it's what we call heteronymous. That's divine authority, right? That's rabbinic authority. But when it comes to reshut, whether we're talking about reshut in the sense of, I'm putting money in my bank account or I'm walking to the library, or we're talking about meaning reshut as opposed to mitzvah, or we're even talking about reshut as opposed to chova, right? Whether we mean reshut or reshut as opposed to usr, right? That you don't have to do it, but you can, or it's not off limits to you. You can't. It might be that it really might be about the individual having authority over their decision to do something, right? The authority is actually put in your hands. You're not obligated to do it. You're not forced not to do it, but the authority is put in your hands. So that is such an interesting category, I think, for a legal system to have. So that's the first thing that I want to do is just to see this category as something that's significant. And that's why I couldn't let Menachot pass us by without looking at the fact that, Bnei Yisrael somchin ve'ein benot Yisrael somchot. That's not the end of the story. Reshut is such an important category for thinking about halachic life and how creative the rabbis were in having this, self-authorized aspect of living even within the halakha. The second thing I want to look at is, okay, what does the Talmud Bavli do with this opinion of Nashim Somchot Reshut that's given to us in the name of Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon? Because actually the Talmud Bavli uses it in at least 3 places to talk about women doing mitzvot that they're exempt from. And I think in a way it starts to round out and say it's not just about this mitzvah, it's actually conceptually telling you that there are mitzvot that people might be exempt from that they may choose to do, right? It's not just, is this mitzvah a reshut or is it a chova? It's vis-a-vis individuals. Can they take on? And so the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, for example, quotes its Mishnah on Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, Ein ma'akvin et hatinokot militkoa. You don't stop on Rosh Hashanah if little kids are playing around with a shofar and they're blowing it. You don't stop them. Hanashim ma'akvin makes it sound like if women are, then you do stop them. V'hatanya, so the Gemara says, but wait, we have a braita. Why would you stop women from blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Ein ma'akvin lo et hanashim v'lo et hatinokot militkoa b'yom tov. We have a braita that says you don't stop women or children from blowing shofar on Yom Tov. Amar Abaye says, I'll explain it to you. Lo kasha. There's no challenge here. Ha Rabbi Yehuda, ha Rabbi Yose, Rabbi Shimon. Right? For Rabbi Yehuda, you do stop women from blowing shofar because he would say that they're not technically obligated, as it's a mitzvah aseh zman grama, time-bound mitzvah. Whereas if you're Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon, you would be okay with that because even if you believe that mitzvah aseh zman grama, woman is not chayevet, she can take it on herself, right? So Titania, again, she's authorized to take it on, right? The authority rests with her. It's autonomous rather than heteronymous, right? Coming from within as opposed to coming from without. Titania, as a braita says, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the sons of Israel, bnei Israel somchin, bnei Israel somchot, right? This is the Sifra that we looked at before, right? Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, the men do, the women don't. Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon omrim nashim somchot reshut. Women have the authority to take upon themselves to lay their hands. So look at how this is being used, not just in the case of smicha, but in the case of another mitzvah that the rabbis declare that women are exempt from because it is time-bound, right? Similar kind of thing you see in the Gemara in Eruvin. Elahaitan. Oh, well, I'm going to ignore it. I'm just going to go with Titania. We learn in a Braita, Michal bat Kushi, Michal, the daughter of Kushi, which some people say this means Shaul. Haita manachat tefillin velo michuba chachamim. She would put on tefillin, and the rabbis did not stop her. Right now, the reason why the rabbis exempt women from tefillin is not. Well, it's not clear. There's a machloket about whether we're talking about tefillin as related to Talmud Torah or tefillin as related to a mitzvah that says Shazman Grama, but we'll see where it goes. V'lo michuba chachamim. The chachamim didn't say anything negative about it. V'ishto shel Yonah hayta ola l'regel, v'lo michuba chachamim. And the wife of Yonah used to go up for pilgrimage on the 3 holidays, and nobody stopped her. Midilom michuba chachamim. The fact that the rabbis didn't stop her, alma kasavar mitzvah that says Shazman Grama here, at least in the case of tefillin, maybe it means that they thought that tefillin was not a time-bound mitzvah. So we say, no, Vidilma Savar La Rabbi Yose. Maybe they followed Rabbi Yose, the Amar Nashim Somchot Reshut, because Rabbi Yose established, right? We have it as Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon in the Sifra. Rabbi Yose established a precedent that women and really people, right? It's a precedent for people being able to take on mitzvot that they are exempt from. Because if that's not the case, you also had another example there, which is the wife of Yonah used to go on pilgrimage for the 3 major holidays and nobody stopped her. Could anybody have argued that that wasn't a time-bound mitzvah? Of course it was. Ella kasava reshut. Rather, he thought it was permissible, right? Hachanami reshut. So to here, and I would say even better than permissible, I'll say volition, right? They have the volition to do it. I'm going to skip the end of that Gemara, and I want to show you one more thing, because first of all, I also gave the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi says that they did actually get mad. They did actually censure Michal bat Kushi for wearing tefillin. They did actually censure Yonah's wife from going on Aliyah Regel, but that's it's just an interesting counterpoint. But the Bavli doesn't seem concerned with that at all. The Bavli goes right on its merry way, talking about women being able to take on mitzvot, right? So the Gemara in Chagiga, Tetzayin Amud Bet, Daber b'nei Israel, v'samach, right? Speak to the sons of Israel, and he will put his hand. B'nei Israel somchin, ve'ed b'nei Israel somchot. The males, yes. The females, no. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shmuel, Omrim b'nei Israel somchot reshut. I love that this gets changed into Rabbi Shmuel, probably because Rabbi Shmuel sees reshut in a lot of places, but originally it's Rabbi Yose and Rabbi Shimon say the women can. And then we have the same thing that we had in the Sifra Nedava. Amar Rabbi Yose says, Sachli Abba Elazar, my father Elazar, who is suggesting knows from the time of the Beit HaMikdash, Pamachat hayalanu egel shosef klei shlamim. One time we had this whole offering, vehevinuhu, le'ezrat nashim, and we brought it to the women's gallery, v'samchu alav nashim, and the women laid their hands on the head. Lo mitnei semicha b'nashim, not because they were required, ela kedei lasot nachat ruach l'nashim, but because they, in order to give them ease of mind. I told you that would be coming back, right? Now, I want to just pause here. One of the things we never discussed is why would it be potentially problematic for somebody who's exempt from doing smicha on an animal to do so? Well, first of all, because you would be doing avoda with the kachim. You would be doing something that is considered labor on a consecrated animal, which is asur. Second of all, on the holiday, you say you're not allowed to ride on animals. So if this was a holiday, it would be even more problematic, right? So the Gemara here wants to understand, okay, wait a second. People are doing this out of reshut, right? And the Gemara wants to understand, but if you do the laying of the hands with force, with like full force, we would allow there to be avoda b'kachim, labor to be done, right? Like a kind of me'ila, a misuse of consecrated animals, just so that people would have ease of mind. Maybe it means that actually smicha was not done with your full force, so there was no issue of avoda b'kachim. Then the Gemara continues, says, no, le'olam emalach ba'inim b'chol kocho. Say, no, you did need to use full force. But the women, because they were doing it because of reshut, so that they wouldn't end up doing avodah b'kachim, they were told, don't do it b'chol kocham, or b'chol kochechem, or kochachem. If that's the truth, then it shouldn't be lo mipnei smicha benashim. It shouldn't say, they did it and they were reshut, but it's not because they're required to do smicha. Typically, they ain't smicha klal. It would say, no, they didn't do smicha the same way that the men did smicha. They did it lighter so that they wouldn't do avodah b'kachim. Amar Rabbi Ami, chad va'od kamer. Rabbi Ami says, actually, what it's really saying is, chad leta l'smicha klal. It's actually the way they did it had to be lighter so that it wouldn't be full smicha, so that it wouldn't be avodah b'kachim. And then va'od, and in addition, kidei lasod nachad baruch l'nashim. This was also for the purpose of bringing, of bringing ease of mind to the women. Now, what I find so interesting about this is that it opens up questions about, okay, when you're doing something out of reshut, is there a possibility that you have to do it differently to watch out for certain things, to watch out for certain elements, right? That's one thing. Another thing that it opens is, can people, because one of the examples that I think about is Tefillat Arvit Reshut, right? And Tefillat Arvit started off as something that was permissible or volitional, right? I have to use that word volitional because it goes with the authority of the person. That was volitional, and then it became something that was required. So the question that I think this whole category opens is, on the one hand, is it possible that if you're doing something, quote unquote, only out of reshut, you have different, what's the word? You have different parameters around it in order to watch out for issues that might arise, right? This example of avodah b'kachim is an interesting issue that would arise, but you can imagine that there might be other questions, right? Like, what takes precedent if you're doing something that is, quote unquote, only reshut, whereas there's something there that's mitzvah and chova, which takes precedent? Does it matter if one of them is time sensitive and the other one is not time sensitive? So you could do both or you can't do both, right? You can imagine things like that coming up if people are doing things out of reshut. But the second thing is, when I think about the Tefillat Arvit example, I wonder to myself, speaking of volition and authority, is it possible to accept something upon yourself as a group and as a community so that ultimately it then becomes obligatory or semi-obligatory? And the reason why I said this is because this is what happened with Mariv. And also because some of the Gaonim and the Rishonim talk about this in terms of women being exempt from the time-bound mitzvot of shofar and lulav, but accepting it upon themselves and now becoming something that is an obligation, or sfirat ha'omer, that now is something that's actually an obligation. So it's the whole category of reshut, I think, is a very creative category because it's, on the one hand, there's aspiration there. On the other hand, you're not, there's an autonomy, right? An aspiration and autonomy often go together, but they don't always go together. But it's something to think about. It's something to consider as like a really interesting layer of rabbinic thinking regarding, like required and worthless. There's actually something in between, or halakha just as heteronymous, just as coming from outside, as opposed to being able to say, well, there's some autonomous aspiration, and that comes in here, and what does that actually look like? Thanks for learning with me, everybody. Looking forward to next time.